Well, good evening. Just so everyone knows, this is not a sermon. This is a class, just like we're doing on Wednesday nights. The difference is it's just me with no Jeff. I was texting Jeff earlier today and spoke to him a little later in the afternoon and said, well, hey, I tell you what, just call my cell about 5 minutes in and we'll put you on speakerphone and you can just jump right on in with me. He said, no, I'll just correct you later, basically. So Jeff, I know you're listening in, and we certainly miss you, and I will do my best. I thought of all kinds of things. I thought, of having Tom Ness stand up here and hold a picture of Jeff in front of his face, and us go back and forth, or a lot of different thoughts I had about it. But certainly, Jeff, you're missed, and look forward to next week having you back in here with us. I thought. Don't want to do a lot of review. We don't really do review other than we kind of touch it just a little bit on Wednesday nights. This is one that I'm just going to do just a little more review than normal, just to catch you up before we step into to verse 16, and I think it's helpful to do so. So if you'll remember, if you'll open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 6, and we were... really spent 2 weeks ago, we spent a considerable amount of time going through the first few verses of this chapter. But I'm going to point you to 3 verses to think about as we step then into verse 16. And I will tell you this, I meant to say this in my opening as well. Kevin was quite upset because I loaded this online. He loaded it in the system today, read through my notes, and said, well, if Jeff wasn't going to be there, this is one I really would have liked to jump in with you. And so if you feel compelled, Kevin, and need to come up here, just come on up and we can roll. That's right. So, okay. So here we go. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 1. Let's start there. It says, beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven. And so you remember that, and we really... As we moved out of the last part of chapter 5, and we made this note even last week, that this is indeed a sermon. Don't think about the chapter breaks, and understand that Jesus is focused here on the heart all the way across. Here in verse 6, though, he starts to make a different point, which is to really challenge them about where their focus is to be and where their focus is not to be. So beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. Then if you notice down in verse 3, he says, but when you give to the poor, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. My apologies, verse 2. So when you give to the poor, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogue and in the streets, so that they may be honored by men. Very similar point to how he opened in verse 1. And then if you move down a little further, and you jump forward to where we are in verse 3, you see he says, I apologize, I'm actually struggling with my contact a little bit, so I'm just going to move this up front. There we go. So in verse 5, when you pray, you are not to be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogue and on the street corners so that they can be seen by men. So same message. Now, I can jump into the lesson. What I had put down just kind of as a beginning simple slide to think about was, if you follow that logic, if you'll notice he says almost the same thing. In verse 2 he says, so when you give to the poor. In verse 5 he says, and when you pray. And then verse 16, which is where we're starting tonight, he says, now whenever you fast. Now, that's almost the exact same statement 3 times, and I think that's a challenge for us to consider as we step into verse 16 in this sermon from Jesus. All 3 of these, if you remember when we talked about it a couple of weeks ago and mentioned it again last week, that all of these, when Jesus is speaking, he's speaking in an affirmative, not saying, so if you pray or if you give to the poor, but he's saying when you pray, when you give to the poor. And here he says, now whenever you fast, which, leads to a little bit of an open question. And the open question is, must we or should we fast? And I think that's the first thing that's worth really looking at in this set of verses. So number one, fasting is mentioned quite often in the Old Testament, really throughout. And we see it from the prophets all the way through to David and Psalms. You see fasting just throughout as part of what the Jews did as they were instructed to do so. Then you step forward into the New Testament, and you don't see as much talk about fasting. As a matter of fact, if you notice the verse that I have up there, Matthew 9:14 through 15 says, "Then the disciples of John came to him, asking, why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus said to them, the attendants of the groom cannot mourn as long as the groom is with them, can they? But the days will come when the groom is taken away from them, and then they will fast." So it was noticed by John's disciples, or at least they had not seen his disciples fast. See the note that I have right before that. Consider what Jesus said here in verse 15, which is, "And Jesus said to them, the attendants of the groom cannot mourn as long as the groom is with them." So they ask a simple question, why do your disciples not fast? He answered by saying something that they really would not understand, but he actually pointed towards mourning. And throughout the Old Testament, when you see fasting, it's usually around four things. One is during times of grief, of significant grief. Two is when people learned that God was about to overthrow them. These are individuals and groups. The third is to demonstrate humility. And what's interesting as you look at these is you find it's almost equal in the first three as far as number of verses where you'd find this if you do a study on fasting. But the fourth one, which is the one that's the most important and seen most often and pointed to actually in the New Testament, and you'll see that in a moment, is when someone wanted to focus completely on God. And so where are we so far? Well, Jesus has said, so whenever you fast, in the affirmative, we know what the Old Testament tells us about it, and we know that there was a question about his disciples and whether they fast or not. If you'll see the next line, and I apologize for the size of this type. This is really kind of set up as my notes. I make a set of notes, as you guys know. I didn't even tell you my title, Do You Fast? But you can see it if you're in the audience. The next step here is, what do we see in the church? And do we see fasting in the church in the New Testament? If you'll notice in Acts chapter 13, verses 2 and 3, and I'll flip over, and if you like, turn over there with me, and we can read that. So Acts chapter 13, verses 2 and 3 says, "While they were ministering to the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them. Then when they had fasted and prayed, laid their hands on them, they sent them away." And then if you'll notice in just forward in one chapter, in chapter 14, verse 23, it says, "When they had appointed elders for them in every church, having prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord in whom they had believed." So here, the New Testament church, and with apostolic example, is fasting. Another is, turn with me over to Matthew chapter 17. Because isn't it interesting, Jesus' answer in Matthew chapter 9, which is, why do your disciples not fast? And then turn over to Matthew chapter 17 and verse 21. Matthew 17 and verse 21, if you'll, matter of fact, let's go back and start in verse 20. And you know that the apostles were troubled and somewhat frustrated because they could not, in essence, solve this evil spirit and remove this evil spirit. And so they turned to Jesus and said, why are we not able to do this? And in verse 20 it says, "And he said to them, because of the littleness of your faith, for truly I say to you, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move it from here to there, and it will move, but nothing will be impossible for you." And then in verse 21 says, "But this kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting." So throughout this walk through the question from John's disciples to Jesus, the apostolic example, and what we see Jesus say here too to his own disciples at this time related to a more challenging maybe miracle than what they had viewed it to be, we see fasting. The question still is fasting something that we should be doing? Is it something that is still as alive today as is giving to the poor and prayer? Well, I'll tell you my answer for that, and I'll tell you what I think. If you'll see the last bullet said, and this is just my own words, it is not commanded that it must be done. We don't see a place within the New Testament where there's a statement about fasting, like we see about a number of things, where there's this affirmative command to fast. However, it's evident that Jesus viewed it as a when you, not an if you. And what's apparent for us today, similar to in the New Testament, when the church had been established, in the New Testament, when they fasted, was there were two parameters of the four that we talked about that still very much so exist, and that we have knowledge about. Number one is when there's grief. And remember in our study back in chapter 5, we talked about what this grief looks like, that we should have a grief that's not necessarily the grief that you feel in the loss. It feels the same, but it's actually pointed towards those that are lost, and a grief on our part towards that, as well as a grief on our part in sending Jesus to the cross. So there's a grief component that should move us to fasting, and it can be all types of grief. But it's also the fourth one that I mentioned on the previous slide, which is drawing closer to God. And if you think about what Jesus said in Matthew 17, verse 21, and you think about the two examples in Acts, both of those were about stepping closer to God, even more so than just prayer. So I would personally say, and I think that the scriptures would show that fasting should be a part of our life. Now let's talk about what that means a little bit, just strictly off of what Jesus said here in the sermon. Next verse. So I'm going to start with verse 16 and finish it out first. Now, whenever you fast, do not make a gloomy face as the hypocrites do, for they distort their faces so that they will be noticed by people who are fasting. Remember what verse 1 said in chapter 6. Be aware of practicing your righteousness before men, so you'll be noticed by them. Same thing on giving to the poor, same thing on prayer. It's almost the exact message. The word fasting is here instead of the others. So he says, when you fast, don't make a gloomy face as the hypocrites do, for they distort their faces so that they will be noticed by people when they are fasting. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. Remember, the same thing on prayer, the same thing on giving to the poor. That their reward is in full if it's only before men, and that's the end of it. All they get from that is the praise of men. But as for you, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that your fasting will not be noticed by people, but by your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. You know, I've gone back and forth on whether I would mention this, but in this Bible class setting, I think I will mention it. I had a young man that worked for me for quite some time, and started out doing ranch work, and then ended up working for one of the companies that I was a part of for a number of years. And he was a Muslim, and I had 14 dead trees in my front yard at one point, and they were cut off where there was a stump like this sticking up. And so he said, hey, I'll bring a stump grinder and I'll solve that. I'll grind all those stumps. This is in the middle of the summer, if I remember correctly, like July. And so he brings a stump grinder, works all day on the stump grinder. Well, at one point I walked out to hand him a bottle of water, and he said, I can't. And I said, why not? He said, well, I just can't. And I'm not the kind to let somebody say, well, I just can't. So I pushed a little harder and said, what do you mean you can't? I can hold you down and pour it down your throat if that's what I need to do. And he said, well, I'm fasting. And he said, so I'll get something to drink tonight. I was impressed by that. And my point being that I certainly disagree with his view of the Father. And I disagree with the fact that knowing that he can't get to heaven without Jesus. And he knows that I think that because we've had multiple discussions about that. But I thought it was, I stepped back and kind of really thought about what that devotion was. And not just that, but the fact that he didn't want to tell me why. That for him, that was a private thing. So it's really what Jesus is saying. Verse 17, but as for you, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that your fasting will not be noticed by people, but by your Father who's in secret. And your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And then you see the notes that I put in there. Similar to giving in prayer, as I've said, this is a personal matter. It's a personal matter between us and God, between the individual and God, and really should not include anyone else. It's the same principle of doing nothing for show, and you know, our object cannot be to appear a certain way to men. And then lastly, our self-denial must be for the eyes of God and not for the eyes of men. Verse 19, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. Now, I will mention my title on this one. Possessions must not possess us. And you're going to see that as we go through the next couple of verses here. The focus here is not dissimilar to what we just finished talking about with fasting. He says, store up for yourself, do not store up for yourself treasures on earth. That's the same as saying is trying to let other people see you when you fast or see you when you pray. It's all about directionally our purpose and this personal aspect between us and the Father. So why not store up things on earth? It's focus. What's this moth and rust destroy? Well, even there, they understood that there were things that were perishable. And the reality is that everything around them was perishable. And that the environment alone that was around it would destroy it over time. And it's a big, deep statement of pointing to something that's eternal versus something that's just here and somewhat simple. But it's hard to understand, and Jesus has been on this for 17 or 18 verses. And he's still going through this through Esther. And then the next part, where thieves can break in and steal. And I'm going to go forward to verse 20. And he says, but instead, and I love how all the way through chapter 6 in particular, Jesus has said, don't do this, but do this. Very similar to the contrast that he did towards the law that we saw in chapter 5. And throughout chapter 6, it's very much so a positive message of, hey, let me tell you what not to do, but I'm also going to tell you what you should do. And that's what he does here. He says, but store up for yourself treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroy. And these treasures in heaven, if you think about it, it's something we've learned since we were in 3-year-old Bible class or earlier. Things that we're to do and the purpose behind them. I think sometimes we can get lost in what we're doing versus who it's for. And the easy way we get lost in that is because we start looking for other people to see us. Have you ever felt really good about doing something where you help someone out and you walk away from it and you go, that just felt really good. But then a few days later, it starts to bother you that they didn't say thank you yet. Have you ever done that? I mean, because we can all, it feels good when we first do it, but there's this point sometimes where we just need that gratification and we need it here. And what Jesus is really talking about throughout this part of his sermon is not only where we're pointing, but also our view of where the gratification comes from. Remember what he said, when you do this in secret, the Father who is in secret will reward you. And we talked about last week how that reward was an eternal reward, which was much bigger than anything we could have here. And that's really the message. He's kind of finishing off this thought that he's been going through when he gets to verse 20. And then he says, and where thieves do not break in or steal. And you can see the note there. I said, verse is something that cannot be stolen from us. Romans 8, verses 38 through 39. I read this, I don't know, 2 or 3 months ago, standing at this podium. And to me, it's one of the favorite set of verses in the Bible for me. It's one of those things where I can hear Chuck Cawthon just saying, that's just the church. You guys, Chuck's sitting over here, Chuck will say something about Texas Longhorn football or anything else, and he just says church, saying that's just the end of the point. There it is, exclamation point. This is one of those Paul's exclamation points. Romans 8, 38 through 39. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Jesus was trying with his disciples at that time, and it's in front of us today for us to have that view that Paul had. To say that nothing can take this from me. If I'm focused on the eternal versus on things that can be destroyed by moss or by rust, then it cannot be taken from me. And then he says, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And you can see by my note, if you can read it, if it's not too small, by the word for, you can say because. So he's finishing the thought by saying, all of this that is before, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys, where thieves do not break in or steal, because where your treasure is. Everything in this sermon from Jesus so far has been from the Beatitudes to the now I says. You remember those where he would say, it has been said, but now I say. And all the way through chapter 6, Jesus is pointing to the heart. Now, he does not disregard or toss away things that are to be done. Notice, he just walked through and in an affirmative way says, when you pray, when you give to the poor, when you fast. But with all of them, the heart has to be part of what is there. And then the last thing I put there was simply, possessions must be possessed. They must not possess their own owners. Then in verse 22, it says, the eye is the lamp of the body. So then, if your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. Now, how is this linked in? I don't know, Jeff and I talk about from time to time as we've gone through this, what the different Bibles or translations will say for headings up here. And if you were to look at the heading in mine, which I can't even see it tonight, as I said, but if you were looking at mine, what you'd see is that when you follow this all the way through, that here in verse 22, that it's part of this same thought. At least that's what this New American Standard Bible would argue. I would agree. And so if you think about Jesus finishing this point, he says the eye is the lamp of the body. Well, how does that relate to everything else that he's been talking about? Go all the way back to verse 1. The I in verse 1 says, I'm doing this so someone else can see me. And what's interesting is that I think sometimes we can start the right way, or we can feel like we can have both drivers. We can have a viewpoint that says, I'm going to do something good, and I'm doing it because I'm doing something good towards God, but I also am going to get this other benefit with men. But look what Jesus said about it. He said, the eye is the lamp of the body, so then if your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. So if the light that is in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? Men can have two motives. We can pray for two motives. We can fast for two motives. The bad eye Jesus is mentioned here is someone that begins looking for a way to be recognized by both God and man for their quote-unquote righteousness. But in the end, your whole body will be full of darkness. In the end, they will only be doing it for the wrong reason. And just like where he said for before, because no one can serve two masters. For he will either hate the one and love the other, or he will be destroyed, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. And certainly, and the King James Version says God and mammon. You can plug in a lot of things behind this, but the point is devotion is singular. The devotion that is required for righteousness is singular. And you really cannot straddle the fence. Isn't it funny? I think we kind of realize that along the way, that some of the mistakes that we make in our life, we learn along the way that we made them because we were not fully committed. And that's in all aspects of our life. If you're not fully committed to something, you're often, the foundation that you're a part of is going to come apart at the seams. And that's really what Jesus is describing here, that it's about a choice. It's about making a choice and having a full commitment. 3 verses for you. The first one on making a choice. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Therefore, rid yourselves of all malice and all deceit and hypocrisy and envy and all slander. And like newborn babies, long for the pure milk of the word, so that you may grow in respect to salvation, if you have tasted the kindness of the word of the Lord. That is a choice. So he's not saying let this pour over you just so it happens to you. Peter is telling them, rid yourselves. That means it's something that they choose to do. Revelation 22, John says, blessed are those who wash their robes so that they may have the right to the tree of life and that they may enter the city by the gates. Not penned by John, not said by John. And then one of my favorites throughout the Bible, and this is one that's almost like John 3:16. And I hope that if you think about this Sermon on the Mount, that you'll consider this verse. When you see this hanging in someone's house or otherwise, you'll think about this verse a little differently. Joshua 24:15. But if it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves today whom you will serve, whether the gods of which your fathers served, which were beyond the Euphrates River, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. What Jesus is asking for here, all the way through, is that we make a choice, and that our choice be God, because we cannot straddle the fence. We cannot be lukewarm, because if we are, then we are lost, and it's simple and utter and complete darkness. Okay, so Jeff, we missed you tonight. We're looking forward to next week, and I'll tell you now, Jeff, online where you're listening. Next week we're going to start in Matthew chapter 6, verse 25, and I'll give you the title, The Cure for Anxiety. So it ought to be a pretty interesting class, Jeff, and Jeff will actually be here next week. We're still trying to decide if we're sitting in 2 chairs or standing at 2 debating podiums. We're not sure which one we're going to do, but I look forward to having Jeff back with us. Thanks for being here tonight. I hope that this study of the Sermon on the Mount is helpful to you as it has been to me and Jeff. We don't talk before the lessons, as we've said many times. We really don't. But we talk after the lessons. And each week after the lessons, we talk about some of the things that maybe we didn't even speak about during the lesson. And it's a very encouraging thing. And it's been a wonderful study for us. So I certainly would say this is not a sermon. It's been a Bible class. But I also would never want to stand here at the podium and not give an opportunity for someone that needs to respond. And we're here and we're ready. If you want to obey the gospel, please come forward. Or if you need prayers of this congregation, it's a wonderful praying congregation with just a great heart. So please come forward at this time if you need to respond.